Imposter syndrome isn't real, but I'm not gaslighting anyone if they've experienced it in the past or if they're going through it right now. What I'm trying to say is that the first line of defense against imposter syndrome is to know and recognize that it isn't real. At least not in the sense that mental health illnesses and conditions can be. That said, like most things with the human mind, it's real if a person believes it is, at least to that person. In that respect, it's real in its consequences or in how it makes one feel about oneself. But it isn't in the DSM or ICD or anything like that. There are no legal drugs to treat it, and describing it as a syndrome is, well, generous. When the effect was first identified in the 1970s, it was called imposter phenomenon, which is a much more accurate name by definition, but not nearly as marketable. Syndrome makes it sound so much more serious. But it's not a psychological malady like depression or anxiety or other clinical maladaptive states of mind. That's good news for someone experiencing it because it means that they can take a DIY approach to managing the intellectual self-doubt it often creates. The bad news being that it does tend to make people who feel like they have it prone to exploitation if they're not careful. It's an easy button that motivational speakers and the self-help industry can push to get victims of imposter syndrome to pay attention to them, almost always at a cost that is out of proportion to what's being offered or taught. I'm going to try to share exactly how to stop experiencing imposter syndrome by way of 3 possible causes that I've identified over the years in both myself and the clients that I've worked with in real life. We're not going to treat the symptoms by using a bunch of forced positivity or semantic sleight of hand to trick people into feeling better in the short term. What we're going to do is we're going to discuss the root causes of what's going on and try to create some agency so that we can be rid of imposter syndrome once and for all in the long term. And this is most assuredly a solvable problem. As in, imposter syndrome is not a life sentence if you don't want it to be. It's a moment in time, albeit an uncomfortable one, but it will pass with effort. We're going to accomplish that by focusing on the premise in my opening line, that imposter syndrome isn't real. It's just a label that camouflages what's actually going on with a distinctive syntax and an official sounding name. There's a poetic quality to it, to be sure. Imposter syndrome. It has a nice flow to it, but the syndrome itself is a garbage term for a real feeling that comes from one of 3 sources in my experience. If we ignore the iterations and go directly to the prime drivers for clarity, we can create a healthy, sustainable path out. And that's usually how it starts for most people. Something simple, but not always readily identified. Imposter syndrome thrives on misinformation and misdirection, but it's remarkably easy to end imposter syndrome once the source is identified and the cause is clear. Full disclosure, I've experienced imposter syndrome. It was many years ago when I was a police officer. I had just been assigned to a supervisor position and I felt like it wasn't a good fit for me. I didn't believe I belonged in the role due to a lot of limiting beliefs about myself. I always saw myself more as a grunt, or as we used to refer to it, a CFL, Constable for Life, the lowest operational rank in the service. Being put in a sergeant position, the next level in the chain of command, felt like a mistake to me for a lot of reasons. It passed with time, but more importantly, with experience. The experience came with evidence, and not the evidence I collected to solve crimes, but the evidence that demonstrated not just to those around me that I belonged in a supervisor role, but to me as well. I was the person who was giving myself imposter syndrome by ignoring all of the evidence I was collecting as I did my job. Evidence of value, evidence of competency, evidence of achievement. See the mistake I was making by ignoring those? Eventually, I stopped ignoring them, and as a result, the imposter syndrome passed. Because as I did my job and saw these things accumulate, I understood that I wasn't so much an imposter as I was just inexperienced and ignorant of my value to the organization. Heightening that sense of imposter syndrome was the negligible amount of training I received for the position. Of course I felt like an imposter, any well-adjusted human being would. I was in the right place, just at the wrong time. In my development and growth, that is. Not having any experience or training, like I didn't, created all this self-doubt, and that's how imposter syndrome likes it. But nobody should feel like an imposter because they're beginners. Being new at something is part of the process of getting good at anything. There's no shame in it. But what if the person is not a beginner? What if I wasn't new at that time? What if they're not new and maybe they've been at something for a while but still feel like they don't belong there? They're probably the second type of person who feels like an imposter, who doesn't see all of the good they've accomplished. If they are, then they really don't have to feel imposter syndrome because they're already doing the thing they feel like they shouldn't be doing and probably have been competently for quite some time, I'm guessing. They just haven't taken a moment to appreciate all that they've likely accomplished. They feel like an imposter because they assume everything they've done well in life is a product of luck, which doesn't exist, while probably taking full responsibility for everything that has ever gone wrong. A defeatist mindset, if there ever was one. They feel like an imposter with everything they do. They're not. They just haven't had good mentors or leaders, the people who are supposed to point out those successes and their worth to the work being done. So they forget to keep track of all the good they've done and all the things they've accomplished because nobody is reminding them to. And keeping track of those things is exactly what they need to do to correct the internal dialogue they have about being an imposter in the role they are fulfilling. The evidence I mentioned earlier that I relied upon to correct my own defeatist mentality, that's exactly what they need to identify, even retroactively if necessary, to counteract the negative spiral that they are in. Evidence of value they've brought to the role, evidence of accomplishment in what they've done, evidence of competency with each success they achieve. Once a person starts cataloging everything they've done in a domain or field of study, they quickly realize that they're not imposters. In realizing that, they can eliminate the sense that they don't belong in the position they're in. They've been telling themselves the wrong story, that they don't know what they're doing. And the real story is that they know exactly what they're doing. And as soon as they accept the new narrative, imposter syndrome goes away. The new narrative is the truth. They didn't get where they are through fakery or forced positivity, which is the key to all of this. Faking anything isn't going to work because a truth propped up by a lie is also a lie. By omission or association, the original lie undermines everything that follows. If they told the first lie, they carry that lie with them forever. Think about that. Only a sociopath could do that and live with it. And imposter syndrome might not be in the DSM, but sociopathy is. Here's the thing though. Sociopaths don't feel imposter syndrome. They're not worried about that and aren't watching this video. They'd be out doing something else more appealing to a sociopath. Whatever that is. Not trying to get rid of their non-existent imposter syndrome. But speaking of sociopaths, let's talk about the third reason someone might feel imposter syndrome. Someone who is lying about something they most definitely shouldn't be. Not quite sociopathic levels of deceit in these circumstances, but similar enough and of a kind that forces a person to avoid direct eye contact on occasion when they look at themselves in the mirror. Credentials, experience, insight, whatever. It doesn't even matter what's being falsified. The point is that the person is faking something and that charade might get them far, but it comes with a lot of self-doubt and clouded thinking. Mostly because any success or attention is unearned, or at least not earned in the traditional sense of the notion of the word earned. It's inauthentic, and nothing fosters feelings of not belonging somewhere as effectively as inauthenticity does. People who decide to fake it until they make it almost always fall into this category because they can't fake it until they make it. Swagger might hide insecurity from external scrutiny, but it rarely does anything for self-esteem and internalized fears of inadequacy. I have yet to see a person succeed in anything that matters leveraging a fake it till you make it attitude, and certainly not in any sustainable way, even if they manage to pull off a successful venture or two in the early goings. So a person who subscribes to that type of thinking feels like an imposter more often than not, and you know why? Well, because they are imposters. That's as linear as it gets. Fake people feel fake. For these people, the best thing they can do is stop faking it. As soon as they do, imposter syndrome disappears. Because as I said, the relationship is linear. Cause and effect are the same thing. Remove one and the other gets removed, removing the feeling of being an imposter with it. Simple to say, but difficult to execute. Want to guess why? Because a lot of personal identity is probably attached to whatever was being faked. Maybe even a career or a relationship. Giving up the identity can be worse as a feeling than the feelings of imposter syndrome. So much so that those types of people almost never overcome imposter syndrome. Super sad story, but also one that was completely avoidable. That avoidability is what we really have to pay attention to here. Imposter syndrome is completely avoidable. But part of that starts from not doing anything to set themselves up for feeling it later. And humans are terrible at planning for the future in this way. Prospection requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness. It's the highest level of metacognition a person can achieve. So of course it's rare. Metacognition is a tool that's purpose not only has to be learned before it can be used, but how to create it has to be learned before it can even be fostered. Imagine if the only screwdriver you owned was one that you not only had to teach yourself how to use, but you also had to invent it in the first place. You'd probably own fewer screwdrivers, if any, I'm guessing. I know I would. This is where too much ego can block a lot of the tools necessary to remove imposter syndrome. They have to be ready to authentically advocate for themselves. They need that sense of agency that I alluded to earlier. As long as they're not delusional about their abilities or worth, then imposter syndrome is a reasonable response to certain circumstances. But it's something they can completely sidestep by accepting that they're a beginner, or recognizing the value that they bring to something, or not faking expertise. Imposter syndrome is a real psychological phenomenon with real effects on a person's state of mind, sure, but it's not a clinical disorder in the strictest sense. Constantly feeling disassociated from roles in life is another thing altogether that requires meaningful professional intervention to address, and that's not what imposter syndrome is at all. It's even reasonable to feel like an imposter at critical moments in life under the right circumstances. But it's not reasonable to feel it all the time. The former happens to the best of us. The latter is an undiagnosed mental health disorder that can be catastrophic. Either way, both erode quality of life. So it's best to figure out what we're dealing with and take positive steps to address it. Acute and intermittent is normal and might even be adaptive if we confront it correctly. Chronic and persistent is not, and is almost always maladaptive. Realizing all of that, we can recognize that imposter syndrome is, well, an imposter syndrome, and we never have to feel like an imposter ever again.